Okay, welcome everyone to Modesto Subbasin's office hours number 3. The topic, as you can see on your screen, is the monitoring well networks. The purpose of the office hours is to hold the event to have an informal conversation about where we are at with the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, or GSP, and answer questions regarding monitoring well networks. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen Pringle with Stantec, and she will give you an overview of how today's events will work.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Michael. As Michael said, my name is Kirsten Pringle. I work for Stantec, and I'm helping support public outreach in the Subbasin. So I just wanted to give you a quick overview of how today's office hours is going to work. This is very similar to our previous office hours if you attended that. So we're going to start. Casey, next slide, please. Great. So we're going to start with a brief presentation with Phyllis Dannon with Todd Groundwater, and she's going to give an update on the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, or GSP, talk about the monitoring well networks, which is the main topic for today's presentation, and then also the management areas for the subbasin and how that relates to the monitoring well networks. Then we'll move into a Q&A from our audience. We're going to start by answering questions on the monitoring well networks, but if there's no other questions from the audience on that, we'll obviously open it up to other questions related to SGMA or the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. And then note that today's meeting is being recorded, and we will post a recording on the STRGBA website after the meeting. So if you want to go back, or if you want to share this link with others that may not have been able to join today, feel free to do that. Next slide, Casey. So there's multiple ways that you can participate in today's meeting. So I want to familiarize you all with your Zoom controls. If you are joining us today on your computer, you should have a button at the black bar at the bottom. It kind of looks like two little people, and it says participants on that. If you click on the participants, this window that you see on this slide will show up. It shows everyone who's attending today's meeting, and there'll be a little symbol that says raise hand. So we'd like you to please raise your hand if you have a question to ask at any time or a comment you would like to make. Once you raise your hand, I'll call on you as the facilitator, and then you can unmute your microphone and then ask your question. And as Michael said, this is meant to be more of a dialogue. So this is not meant to be very formal Q&A. So anytime you have a question, feel free to pause us. If you have ongoing feedback, you can provide it that way. This is really meant to help you and answer any questions you have about the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. Next slide, please, Casey. So the other option is if you are maybe having audio issues, or you don't want to open your microphone, maybe you have background noise or a barking dog like I do sometimes, you can also type your question or your comment into the chat box into Zoom. And so you can do that again if you look on your bottom black bar in the Zoom. There is a little button that looks like a talking bubble that says chat. So you can put your question, your comment in the chat box. It'll be received by us, the organizers, and then I, as the facilitator, will read your question or comment out loud on your behalf. Note that the default for the chat box is that your question or comment will go to everybody. And so if you don't want all the participants to see it, there is an option in that drop down in order to send it just to the organizers, so only I'll see it. And the last note is, if you do type in the chat box and you want to be renamed anonymous, so you don't want me to state your name, just please make sure to indicate that, and I won't say who the question or comment is from. Next slide, please, Casey. Oh, so I think that's the beginning of our presentation. So if you can go back to the next one, I just like to pause here. One final reminder too, this is an open dialogue. We ask you that, though, please mute your microphones when our wonderful presenter, Phyllis, is speaking, and also when people are answering questions or asking questions, there'll be plenty of opportunity for Q&A. So before we move on to our presentation, I just want to see if anybody has any questions about today's format, the agenda, or how to participate in today's meeting. Again, raise your hands if you have any questions you'd like to ask, or you can type that in the chat box now. Okay, I don't see any raised hands. So we're going to move on and start with our presentation by Phyllis Dannon with Todd Groundwater. Phyllis, take it away.
Thanks so much, Kristen, and thank you, Casey, for managing the slides today. I thought we would just start with a picture of the Modesto Subbasin. The STRGBA GSA is developing the GSP in this area, and you can see the 247,000 acres that is the Modesto Subbasin. It's bounded on the north by the Stanislaus River, the west by the San Joaquin, and the south by the Tuolumne. And in the east, it extends just a little bit into to Tuolumne County in a couple of places and is bounded by the Sierra Nevada foothills. You can see by the colored areas there that we have a real variety in this subbasin, a large city with the city of Modesto, many urban communities, Oakdale, Riverbank, Waterford, and other smaller communities as well. And then two very important irrigation districts. The Modesto Irrigation District shown in the green around the city there, and the Aqua to the east in the central portion of the basin of Oakdale Irrigation District. Next slide, Casey. So today we're focusing in on where we are and what we've done so far and some of the details of the monitoring networks. This is a slide that simply shows the main tasks associated with the GSP. You can see by the yellow bars what has been completed to date. So as we have gone through 2019 and 2020, we've completed most of the technical work that serves the basis of this groundwater sustainability plan, including the developing of the model and the data, the plan area, hydrogeologic conceptual model, groundwater conditions, and water budget. So that's all together, and we are using that to develop the sustainable management criteria. And so that's kind of where we are so far. But in the process, and if you'll go to the next slide, you can see kind of what we're doing now, finishing up that sustainable management criteria, but also working on projects management actions and monitoring networks. And so because those three items are so closely related, we wanted to make sure that we held an office hours that provided some input on these monitoring networks. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Next slide. A lot of people think about a monitoring well and wonder exactly why is it different from the other wells in the basin. And the answer is because, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's exactly the same as a production well in the basin, but we use it for a different purpose. We use these monitoring wells in this network to collect information on water levels, sometimes water quality. The levels can help us evaluate groundwater surface water interaction. And then there's a lot of other information and data that we can collect from these wells. The GSAs are going to use this network to demonstrate compliance with the GSP regulations. So this network is a pretty important component, not only for the development of the GSP, but will be in progress, will be used for the progress going forward. The data specifically is going to be used to monitor groundwater levels, but that's going to give us the information that we need to evaluate compliance with sustainable management criteria and measure the progress toward meeting our management goals. And then there's a little picture there you can see of a very small diameter monitoring well from the USGS. Next slide. For our monitoring network, we made the best use, I think, of existing wells and then incorporating some new wells into the program as well. There's 64 wells in the network, and they come from a variety of sources. Some of them are existing monitoring programs, such as the CASGEM program. This is, and you may be familiar with this is the California State Groundwater Elevation Monitoring Program. It's been in place since, 2011, 2012. And we are employing 37 wells out of that CASGEM network into the GSP monitoring network. And that was real important to us because that historical data and information that was already available for the CASGEM program is really a wonderful basis for establishing management criteria and being able to incorporate that information going forward. The city of Modesto is contributing 6 of their monitoring wells. They have over 100 in their production wells in their well field, but they've also installed some very discrete and deep monitoring wells in their area. And those are wonderful for gathering the scientific data that we need for the various principal aquifers. So we're incorporating that into the network as well. And then finally, USGS, you might recall several years ago, they put together a model in the subbasin. And in doing so, they installed some wells of their own. 4 of those wells were very helpful in supplementing sort of data gap areas or deep vertically discrete monitoring wells. So again, 47 existing wells. But even with those wells, we did have some areas where we really didn't have enough information. So we were able to get a successful grant through the Sustainable Groundwater Management Program planning grants that the DWR offers. It's being funded through Proposition 68 for this particular grant. And with that money, we were able to install 17 new wells. And so I'd like to look at those now. You can see these on this next slide. The red dots show the locations where 17 wells were drilled in the subbasin. There are 11 locations. And so what that means is that at 6 of these areas, we were able to install 2 wells at the same location. And that was important to us because then we get a better understanding of vertical flows. And in particular, in the Western subbasin, 2 different principal aquifers, the Western upper principal aquifer, which is above the Corcoran clay, and the Western lower principal aquifer, which is below the Corcoran clay. You can see from the red dots there that we were able to combine our new wells both in urban communities as well as in non-district areas. We were able to get wells in the cities of Oakdale and Riverbank, and also West Modesto in the urban areas in Salida, and a little area near the airport in southern portion of Modesto, also in Empire and Waterford. And then you can see 7, 8, 9, and 10 in the eastern portion of the subbasin. This was an opportunity for us to fill in those data gaps where we really didn't have information, and we wanted to get additional wells to bolster our plan in those areas. So that grant turned out to be a very nice windfall for the subbasin in getting together some additional and key monitoring points for the network. Next slide. So what we'd like to do today with you is just quickly run through the draft maps of the GSP networks. They're organized both by the sustainability indicators, and you might recall under the groundwater sustainability plan that we're developing, we have indicators that help us better understand what groundwater conditions we want in the subbasin. And you can see that chronic lowering of water levels, reduction of groundwater and storage, those are the things that we'd obviously want to avoid. And so we put together minimum thresholds and measurable objectives to help us know when we're getting close to what's called the undesirable results. Another sustainability indicator is the depletion of interconnected surface water and then land subsidence. So our monitoring networks are essentially focused on these sustainability indicators for our own monitoring in the subbasin. We do have an additional monitoring network for water quality, and I'm going to just not, we're going to be focused on just what we're going to be monitoring tonight. The MTs and MOs are quantified at each one of those monitoring sites. So if you have a well, we have actually quantified a minimum threshold and a measurable objective for that well, and that will help us better understand the levels at which we'd like to operate the basin. The wells are distributed throughout the principal aquifers as needed for each one of the indicators. And I mentioned those previously, the Western upper principal aquifer, the Western lower principal aquifer, the Corcoran clay being the dividing line in the middle, and the Eastern principal aquifer, which is east of the Corcoran clay extent. Next slide, let's start to look at these networks. So here we have our first map of our monitoring network. This is for the chronic lowering of groundwater levels. And so we're showing 2 principal aquifers here. The Western upper principal aquifer is to the west of that red dashed line. So it's that western, about 20% of the basin there. And that is the area above the Corcoran Clay. And then east of that dashed line is a much larger portion, about 3/4 of the subbasin is actually the eastern principal aquifer. And that doesn't have the regional clays such as the Corcoran Clay to divide up. So the eastern principal aquifer is looked at as one relatively continuous aquifer system. In the western principal aquifer on the west, we've got 17 wells scattered throughout that area. And if you have a chance to review these maps in detail later, if you're interested, you can see the well types and where the wells came from, being that CASGEM program, the City of Modesto wells, or some of these new wells that we drilled under the Prop 68 grant. And then in the eastern aquifer, 42 wells are in that area, covering again about 3/4 of the basin. And there's just some numbers. Since there were so many of them, I went ahead and just provided that information there, most of which are in the CASGEM program. Again, helpful to us because it has historical information. Next slide. Moving now to the western lower principal aquifer, you'll see I'm not including anything in the east on this map. This is the aquifer that's beneath the Corcoran Clay, and you can see we don't have quite as many wells that are screened solely in that lower principal aquifer. So we were very happy to have those 2 new red wells that are shown there in the north and the south in that area that supplemented our lower principal aquifer data. We also have important wells here from the City of Modesto, and the USGS has one as well. So again, a limited number in the lower principal aquifer. It's an okay starting place, but we will use this information and need to supplement the area for additional wells in the future. But we have at least a good start with respect to MTs and MOs in these areas. Next slide. So the second indicator is reduction of groundwater and storage. And I'm not showing maps for that indicator because we are using the sustainable management criteria for the chronic lowering of water levels as a proxy. So what that means is that the monitoring network for the chronic lowering of water levels provides us with the detailed information that we also need to make sure that we are not seeing continuing or long-term overdraft conditions, which would reduce our groundwater and storage. And so we're able to combine our monitoring networks. That really is a way of facilitating groundwater management in a subbasin to be able to get as much use out of your wells as you can. And this network, again, is applied to all 3 principal aquifers, the 3 we just looked at, same network, same MTs, and same MOs. So now let's look at the next sustainability indicator with the next slide, and that is the interconnected surface water. So now, because we are using the groundwater levels to compare to the stages and the elevation of the river channels in the river boundaries of our subbasin, you will see that the monitoring network is clustered closely to the 3 river boundaries. So you see wells in the north there, again, along the Stanislaus, 2 wells in the west along the San Joaquin, and the wells along the Tuolumne River in the south. The Tuolumne River really has great coverage. For the Stanislaus, there's areas both to the west in the lower reaches of the river and to the east in the upper reaches of the river where we don't have current information. So that's an area of data gaps that we're going to be needing to fill in the future as well. But again, we have the central portion covered real well for the beginning and the start of the GSP monitoring network. We have relatively better coverage along the Tuolumne. You can see on the bottom portion of the map there, where we have quite a few wells that are scattered along the Tuolumne River. Again, we're going to be using these wells to look at the groundwater levels, comparing that to the river, and make some determinations as to whether or not the river is contributing to the groundwater system or the groundwater is contributing to the river system. These are all interconnected, so there's a lot of interaction. It's a very dynamic system along these river boundaries, and so these wells help us monitor the sustainable yield that we have determined for each one of these rivers to make sure that we don't over deplete the river system because we let our water levels fall too low. And moving to our last sustainability indicator with the next slide, we'll start to look at the land subsidence. So land subsidence has not been determined to be a problem in the Modesto subbasin. In fact, we've really seen no impacts from land subsidence at all to date. However, because we have the Corcoran clay in the western portion of the subbasin, it's a compressible clay, and in other portions of the San Joaquin Valley, it's been associated with land subsidence. And as such, we want to make sure that we're monitoring so that if we actually see land subsidence in the future, we'll be able to know about it and deal with it. So we have 20 wells in this network. It's actually the same network that we put together for the chronic lowering of groundwater levels, pretty well distributed throughout the area, composed of, again, CASGEM wells, wells from the city, new wells, and USGS wells. And this is for the upper principal aquifer, but for the land subsidence, we also want to monitor below the Corcoran clay. And so if we go to the next slide, we will see that we have a land subsidence monitoring package in the lower principal aquifer as well. And if you're comparing maps, you're saying this looks suspiciously like the lower principal aquifer that we saw for the chronic lowering of water levels. And indeed, you're correct. This is, again, really a nice way to manage a groundwater basin if you can combine as much information together so that you don't have too many details in the field that you're trying to manage all at one time. And if you have clear, clean, measurable objectives and minimum thresholds that coincide with several of these sustainability indicators, then you have a much better shot at being able to understand what's going on in the subbasin and putting it all together. So those are the networks, and the next steps as we go forward, we've got just summarized briefly on this last slide here. We want to finalize the MTs and the MOs. I meant to mention this when we were going through the maps, but if you have downloaded this file, you'll be able to zoom in more readily on your computer and see that there are numbers associated with each one of those monitoring wells that were on those network maps. And those are the preliminary minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. So I've provided those to you just for your information and viewing pleasure in the future. But we're continuing to evaluate those and continuing to look at how those go together with respect to the whole monitoring network. So it's not quite finalized yet, but this is several revisions into the monitoring network. So we're very close to having this be the final. And next thing that's coming up after that, and not really after that, but in concurrence with that, are the release of additional GSP chapters. We've prepared the water budget chapter, and the TAC has already reviewed that and provided comments. We'll be getting those comments incorporated and then publishing that chapter, which is coming up next. We're in the middle of putting together the writing of the sustainable management criteria chapter. We just have a few more details of criteria to finalize with the TAC, and then we'll be putting that chapter out. The monitoring networks will look very similar to what you have seen today, with a little more detail and some tables of these wells with a little more specificity, and that will be following the sustainable management criteria chapter. We're in the process of just analyzing all of the projects that have been brought forth. We'll have some preliminary results for those project analysis coming to you at the next STRGBA meeting, which is coming up in the second week of September. And I don't quite have the date in front of me, but I'm going to get that for you before we finish this. And in the process of analyzing the projects and putting together the sustainable management criteria, we're developing how the basin will be managed, how the GSAs will be working to make sure that we're in compliance with the MTs and MOs. And in thinking through how that management will occur, the TAC is developing some management actions. So we have preliminary lists so far, but haven't put the meat on the bones quite yet. and some of those will be tied back to the projects as well. So we are really walking and chewing gum at the same time with 3 concurrent things going on, a lot of action, a lot of activity, but we are getting close to getting things finalized. So appreciate you checking in with us tonight and talking to us about the monitoring network. So Kirsten, if I can turn it back over to you. It looks like we've got some questions already.
Yeah, that's all me, just chit-chatting away in the chat box.
Oh, okay.
We'll check the calendar and it looks like the next meeting is on September 8th. So someone correct me if I'm wrong. And in the chat box, if you're joining us via your computer, I dropped the link to the meetings page on the STRGBA website. So that's where we have all the agendas, the meeting materials, and the minutes for meetings that have already happened, and recordings as well, which is also a really good resource. So you can check back there.
Great, thanks.
Well, thank you, Phyllis. So we're now on to our Q&A. So as a reminder, we're trying to focus today's Q&A session on the monitoring network, which is what Phyllis just described. If you have other questions related to STRGBA or development of the groundwater sustainability plan, we're definitely open to discussing that as well. Again, this is meant to be a dialogue. We're not doing a super formal Q&A, so we're just here to answer your questions. And as our main speakers today, we have Phyllis, obviously. We also have Michael Riddell with the City of Riverbank, who opened our meeting. And then we also have Walt Ward on the line for Stanislaus County. They'll be our main speakers, but we also have, I think, representatives from all the member agencies of STRGBA on the line as well. So if you have any questions specific to your member agency region, we have someone on the line that may be able to answer that. So I have a few kind of pre-prepared questions, but before I go, I just wanted to see if anyone wanted to start out by asking a question or providing a comment. I remind everyone that you can raise your hand and then I'll call on you, or you can just unmute your mic since we don't have too many people, or you can also drop your question or comment in the chat box.
Yeah, hey, this is Walt. I'd like to make a comment.
Yeah.
Everybody can hear me okay?
Yep, we can.
Following Phyllis's presentation, I think it's important for everyone to understand how significant the monitoring network is. In many respects, that is the way by which we will measure our performance. And you know, the old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure. And what I mean by that is, you know, the GSP so far has identified the basin setting and the hydrologic conceptual model, and we've addressed the, you know, resource areas of concern. We've talked about sustainable management criteria. We talked about establishing minimum thresholds and management objectives and all those things. But we can't do any of that if we don't have information from the field. And that means collecting as much information over time as we can to help understand the dynamics of the aquifer system, especially in response to pumping. I mean, that is the physics of the system. Where you have groundwater pumping in one part of the basin and you have observed measurable drawdown, that is not the same as saying it will occur in another part of the basin because of the changing geology. So having a good geographic distribution of the wells, both you know, X, Y, and then also in their vertical, allows us to collect an awful lot of information. And frankly, we can never ever have enough. That's just the way of the world when you get into groundwater, and there's we are open. I see some of the visitors today, and you know, the participating listeners. You and I and others have all talked about this subject before. So we are open to, you know, data sharing in whatever way that can help us all understand better how to manage the basin over time. And insofar as you have data that you can share, I think it would be wise, it would be best if you know, channel that through our main contact. And I believe STRGBA is being chaired by Eric Thorburn and in consultation with Phyllis. If you have interest in sharing, any information, please contact us. It's critical as we go forward. So I didn't want to underemphasize how important the monitoring network is and how we will always be in a position to need more information. Thank you.
An exclamation point on that. Well, I think sometimes when we talk about all this technical stuff, what gets lost is the importance of what we're doing or why we're doing certain things. And so I think you really explained that well. So I don't see any questions yet, but one of the questions I had kind of touches on something you said, Walt. So if people have a well on their property, maybe a domestic well or agricultural well, and they'd be interested in maybe sharing that data or adding that well to STRGBA's monitoring well network, what's the process for doing that? And is there certain criteria that a well has to have to be included in the network?
Yeah, I think Phyllis is probably best, or Liz. Certainly not all wells will be applicable. There is screening criteria that we have to go through. And to make it useful, we don't want to collect data that doesn't provide purpose. So I think Phyllis or Liz, you could probably provide through the STRGBA channels, perhaps what that screening criteria might look like, or where we have gaps or unknowns, or where, how best to go forward with that.
Right. I'll just say a couple of quick things. So we do have criteria for these wells. We would prefer that the wells not be active pumping wells if we can find them. Now, we do have active pumping wells in our program because it's very difficult to find inactive wells that we have a lot of information for. But we're trying to monitor the aquifer, not the efficiency of a well. And so we really would like to be able to have a non-pumping well so that we can get a better understanding of what's going on in the aquifer outside of the well, rather than something that's being controlled by a pumping well. So that's kind of a big one right there. We need construction information. It's important for us to be able to understand which principal aquifer we're tapping with the well. So the screen information, the diameter of the well, any information that we can get with respect to the inside of the well is very important to us. Another important criteria is whether or not the well has static water level data already from the historical record. One of the things that we're doing to select minimum thresholds is to look at what has happened with the aquifer at that well over time. In other words, what is the aquifer response in that well been historically to the historical hydrology conditions? That will help us better predict what will happen with that well going forward, the water levels with that well going forward. So having the historical data is important. If it isn't there, such as in our new wells, we're still going to take it because the new wells provide non-pumping conditions and they provide a good distribution. So vertical and horizontal distribution are two other criteria. And then the final thing to say, which is not the least important, it might be the most important, is we need access. We need to be able to get to that well under a variety of conditions to be able to get the information of what's happening in the aquifer in response to whatever might be happening on the ground. So access, construction, location, and historical information, all critical pieces of the network. Thank you, Walt.
Great, thank you for getting that overview. And if people had any follow-up questions, I'm assuming they can contact you, Phyllis, or Eric, as Walt was mentioning. I'll just take a pause before I move on to my next question, see if we have any questions or comments from our audience. You can also just unmute your mic if that's easier for you, or you can put it in the chat box. Okay. not seeing anything, so I'll move on to a couple of questions about the new groundwater monitoring wells. So you kind of touched on some of this a little in your presentation, Phyllis, but this was a question that we got at our last office hours, and I think is good to circle around back to. And it's about how the wells were paid for. So could you talk a little more, or Michael or Walt, whoever feels most comfortable, about how the new groundwater installation of new groundwater wells was paid for, and then how operation and maintenance moving forward will be paid for as well?
The subbasin was so incredibly lucky because we were able to get $1 million grant through the Sustainable Groundwater Management Planning Grant Program administered by the state, administered by DWR specifically. And a big shout out to the city of Modesto. Oh my gosh, their engineer and planner that is leading this effort with the GSA. Miguel Alvarez is on the line, and we owe him a real debt of gratitude in the subbasin. He pushed forward to get the grant application in under very difficult circumstances and very tight deadlines, and really made an effort to make sure that we were also siting our wells in underrepresented communities, in areas of domestic wells, and areas that really had not been monitored well in the past. So we now have, thanks to Miguel and his efforts, the city's efforts, we now have wells in a lot of these communities that we didn't previously. Empire comes to mind, Salida, some of the other local areas. So Miguel worked with the STRGBA GSA to develop these locations, develop the criteria, and make sure that a robust monitoring well was in place and that we made best use of our grant funds. So yep, that's a lucky thing for the subbasin. So we're grateful to the city, and we're grateful to DWR for the money.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that all these wells have been permitted through the county and have been constructed. So I think they're up and ready and running, not running, but up and ready and available to collect information. I believe that the going forward, the STRGBA agency will take ownership, but yet the individual agencies within which the well location is identified will take over the monitoring. For example, there's a couple of the wells in that network that are in unincorporated Stanislaus County. So Stanislaus County, as being a member agency of the STRGBA GSA, will be the entity then going forward for collecting water level data, water quality, whatever calls for in that particular well. And likewise, the other agencies have also stepped up and will take responsibility for the actual in-kind, costs of the monitoring. So in that regard, the agencies will be carrying the costs, at least as far as their staff time. I don't think we've talked yet about establishing a contract with a water quality laboratory, but we will do that. And we will figure out the way to best and most fairly cost share that effort too.
Thanks. And this is kind of a follow-up question, but I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in the data you collect from these. I mean, you talked about the importance, but especially for individual well owners, whether they have a domestic well or agricultural well, they're probably really interested in where the groundwater level is at, what the quality of water in the region is at. So how will members of the public and individual well owners be able to have access to the data, either in aggregate level or on the individual level?
The data are required to be incorporated into each annual report, which of course is a publicly available document. In addition, they're going to be provided to DWR twice annually. DWR is going to put them on their monitoring network module, which is an on-site It's part of their Sigma portal, and it will be an online service. They don't quite have the monitoring network up and running to the point where you can pull down data right now. I don't think you need to be a GSA to do it, but I'm sure they will have a public participation sort of module associated with that. So the data will absolutely be publicly available.
I'm going to open it again for any questions. Do we have anyone that has a question either on the groundwater monitoring network or anything related to Sigma, the groundwater sustainability plan? Just looking over to see if anyone has their hand raised.
This is Dennis Witcho.
Hi, Dennis.
How do we see what projects have been submitted for consideration by the GSA?
Should I take that, you guys? We have presented a preliminary list of projects. I can't remember exactly what meeting that was, but we went over the first pass on that. And the details of some of the projects are still being put together. The first projects that we will see will be coming from the urban communities. We have some stormwater projects and a recharge project that the city of Modesto is sponsoring, and some projects to assist the city of Waterford with water supply. Those projects are being analyzed now with respect to the modeling to look at the benefits. But other projects are still being put together, and some of the details are still coming in on those involving recharge projects in the non-district east area and other things that are being considered as well. So that was a long-winded answer that didn't exactly say when, because I'm not exactly sure, but certainly in the coming month, we're going to be able to, at the next meeting, we'll be talking about some of the preliminary modeling results. And at that point, we will have additional information on projects as well. So stay tuned. We anticipate having 2 meetings in September, one being on the 8th, and then a special meeting, which has not quite been scheduled yet, but the projects will be discussed at both of those meetings in September.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And you mentioned also that there are preliminary management actions that you've been working on. How do we see what those look like?
We don't have the details of those yet. We will be pulling some of those together and providing those. I would anticipate that at least the second meeting in September, we would have some of that information associated with that to show to the public. Some of it's a little bit dependent on the project, so we're going back and forth.
So they're not currently available for public viewing?
Not yet.
Got it.
Hey, Kirsten, this is John Davis. I have a question for Phyllis, if that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Hey, Phyllis, thanks again for the good presentation, as always. So if new wells, come into the mix, either through landowner participation or additional funding down the line for construction of additional monitoring wells, what do you see as the process for the GSA to update their monitoring network? Does that wait until the 5-year update? How does the GSA proceed with inclusion of those wells if they want?
So they can do that with their annual report. They can, we are not going to be changing sustainable management criteria. And when I mean that, I mean the approach to the sustainable management criteria in the first few years of the GSP implementation period, but we can add wells and we'll be encouraged, I'm sure, to add wells. And we're putting together, Dennis had asked about management actions. One management action that's clear is going to be improvement of the monitoring network. So we will put together some of the details of the data gaps and how we anticipate filling some of those data gaps going forward. And if there are wells that are in critical areas that provide important information, then all you have to do is to contact the GSAs, and we will evaluate the potential for bringing it into the network. And that can be done officially in the annual report, but don't wait for that annual report. If there's something available at any time, please contact the GSA. We could start monitoring and getting some information and data prior to the next annual report. So that's the process, and you absolutely can add it going forward over time.
Thanks, Phyllis. That's really helpful.
Thank you. Nice to hear your voice again.
And for those that don't know, the annual reports are published of April of every year, starting the April after the GSP is submitted. So the first will be, yeah, so soon. So the first will be in April of next year, and then every year thereafter.
Yeah, and I wanted to say something about the annual report, because I've been involved in that process in a couple of other basins for a couple of years now with annual reporting. And it seems that so far, the effort has been to sort of make sure you're in compliance with what DWR wants to see. And that's very true, and you've got to achieve that. But I think more importantly, we need to think of these annual reports as opportunities for ourselves. Really, they're progress reports. You know, how are we doing? What needs to change? Where are we encountering problems? What is the condition of the basin? I mean, we really need to make them not only useful for being in compliance, but we need to turn them inward and make them useful for ourselves. And I'd like to see STRGBA, you know, think of it that way, that more than anything, we use the annual reporting as an opportunity to measure our own performance, and not think of it so much as checking the box and DWR, you know, finds us in compliance. So local ownership, local control, you know, local management, these are all the things that will make us successful. I can't overemphasize that enough.
And I would like to piggyback that on what Walt just said too, when you get into that aspect. With the state of California moving forward, as we all know, we're currently in a drought, and we don't know how that process is going to play out come this winter, next spring, next summer. And we've had, myself as a water purveyor for the city of Riverbank, have had to deal with that since 2015 when we had those issues. And the state is mandating data, and when they mandate the data, obviously they don't give you money to pay for that data. But when we do aspects like this, where we have the ability to go in through a grant that Miguel was very good at getting for us, and be able to not use technical terms here, to be able to stick a straw in the ground where we can actually see what the water is doing. And if we want to, we can monitor quality and this kind of thing. These type of things for me is nothing new. I started my career in wastewater, and you live and die by a monitoring well around your plant. So you have those issues, but it is very, very good tool, and the biggest tool you can have to be able to make sure that you're seeing exactly what's occurring.
Thanks. I really like those points, especially talking about how we can make the annual report maybe more useful for the agencies, rather than, I think Walt used the term checking the box exercise. And I know that's always a struggle, but thank you for those perspectives. Do you have any questions for anyone else on the line? All right, quiet group tonight. I see a couple of people who attended our last meeting as well. Casey, do we have a final kind of wrap up slides? We can end a little early. Oh, that's it. That's fine. I haven't. Well, I just wanted to thank everyone for attending this evening. Hopefully this was helpful and got to listen to some of our back and forth conversations. As a reminder, the next meeting for the STRGBA group is on September 8th. And it sounds like I heard Phyllis say that there's going to be a second meeting in September as well, the date TBD. As always, if you're interested in hearing those meetings, like I heard some questions about projects and management actions, I know that's going to be a focus of the September meetings, the next couple of meetings going forward. The best way to stay informed about that is make sure that you're on the STRGBA email list, and you can do that by either emailing your GSA representative, or you can go on the website, and it's really easy to sign up. And then you'll get notices of events like this, but also all the meetings. And then all the meeting agendas and materials, like I said, are also on the STRGBA website. So I dropped it in the chat box, but if you're calling in only, it's pretty easy to navigate. You just go to the STRGBA website and then go to the meetings page. I think those are all the reminders I had. Did anyone have anything else they just wanted to note before we sign off today? All right. And then as a reminder, we'll also post this recording. So if you know someone that maybe wasn't able to make it today that might be interested, or if you want to revisit anything we said, well, we'll post the recording probably in the next week or two. We just got to clean it up a little first. So thank you everyone for their time, and especially thank you to Michael, Walt, and Phyllis for being our presenters and main speakers today. And hopefully we'll talk to you soon. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Have a good evening.